All right. Well, hopefully you've recovered from taking your test, and we're going to move on into this next section of the course. And we're going to start here in chapter 9 discussing a fellow who's really an interesting individual. It's Andrew Jackson and his rise in popularity, the change, the shift in how people view presidents and the electoral process, and just basically the whole concept of what our republic ought to be. And it all shifts at this point. And so we'll see the end of the notables era and the rise of what's known as Jacksonian democracy. Now, previously, we talked about the era of good feelings, which had lasted for about a dozen years or so, from essentially the end of the War of 1812, when the Federalist Party virtually disappears, leaving only one major national party, the Democratic Republicans, who start just calling themselves the Democrats pretty soon afterwards. So the national election's virtually free of party politics. It's all a little bit of interior party factional fighting over basically who's going to get the nomination, because that's the person that's going to really basically win. Um, and so there were factions within the party. A lot of people in the party had come to support some Federalist policies, things like the Second Bank of the United States and the need to build up infrastructure. Henry Clay, for example, big proponent of that. John Quincy Adams believed in those things. Others oppose those ideas strongly. And this conflict, again, it's a bit over loose construction versus strict construction or interpretations. That's going to help contribute to the end of the era of good feelings. Another thing that is going to start happening is that the notables, the people of good families and long-standing wealth who had dominated the politics of the early republic are going to lose some of their strength, some of their power. And that's largely because of two things. One is Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood um, is the idea that women's role is to raise children, of course, it's a very traditional sort of thing, but is part of that, not just take care of them and feed them and clothe them and everything, but to instill in them the political ideas of the republic, the idea that all men were created equal and that they all have the same rights, and that they have a patriotic duty to their nation. And that part of that was to participate in the republic. Basically, that is to be engaged in the political process and thereby mold these kids into good citizens of a republic or Republican citizens. Um, Something else that's going on, the other part of it is that more people are getting the ability to vote. More and more states are reducing the property requirements. The franchise is being extended to men who don't have land or wealth, just regular guys. And these men would quickly vote out the notables in favor of people who were like them, who they felt would understand what they needed and would represent them better. Now, a French visitor to the United States in this era who went home after a good while here in the U.S. He went back to France and he wrote a book about America and the democracy he found here. And he noted that the regular people, the mob is what they call them, regular old folks who didn't have money and property and fancy educations and such, they called them just the mob. Um, Alexis de Tocqueville would note that they jealously refused to elect their intellectual superiors, uh, meaning that they were somewhat anti-intellectual. They, to a degree, resented the idea that these people were better suited to lead simply because they had had the wealth and leisure to obtain educations and such like that. Uh, so they're going to outvote the old sort of patriarchal, patronizing, notable Republican system where only a few people really controlled who got elected. So by 1824, most states would allow most white men to vote, and that's going to help shift who gets elected. So while on the national level, there's officially only really one party, locally speaking, parties are beginning to form. And this is really sort of still factions within the one big party, but they're going to develop more and more. And the idea of these is, of course, to promote the policies that certain groups within the larger party preferred. Okay, so think of them as sort of like interest groups. So Van Buren creates the very first political machine that will be statewide in New York. And the point of this is to help get the right candidates elected. And how they do that is they use three things that are fairly new at this point. Okay, Van Buren actually owns a few newspapers, and he's going to use them to editorialize and propagandize for the topics for the policies that he's in favor of and against those that he is opposed to. This is to help sway voters. He also uses a system of patronage that will become later known as the spoils system. Basically, that means when the party wins and gets control of the legislature or whatever, they would then hand out jobs or contracts to their supporters, the people who had helped get them elected. Van Buren also started to use a caucus. This is where the party leaders would meet ahead of time and make sure that everybody agreed on what they were supposed to vote, how they were supposed to vote. So let's say the issue is, I don't know, free school lunches. That's a good one for poor children. They're going to decide, okay, how do we feel about this? Most of us feel like we want these, right? Everybody sort of says, yeah, we're good with that. So, okay, when it comes up, everybody's going to vote for the free school lunch. So everybody knows exactly how they're supposed to vote. This helps them to keep the votes concentrated and therefore get their policies passed. So in 1828, when the election rolls around for president, Van Buren is going to use these methods to help Andrew Jackson. Now, if you recall, Jackson had felt cheated in the election of 1824 when Adams won in what he and his supporters called the corrupt bargain. So Jackson would spend the next 4 years beating that drum of corrupt bargain. The presidency was sold. You can't trust these notables. They're all rotten. They look out for each other and not for you. And for 4 years, he just kept banging that drum, right? And he's got the help of people like Van Buren, who were putting that in the newspapers and things over and over and over and over again. So in the election of 1828, he comes back, and he's already been campaigning basically for 4 years. And he promises he is going to look out for the interests of the little guy, the common man. Later on, this concept will become known as populism. I didn't call it that yet. But this is what he's talking about. I'm looking out for the little guy. I understand who he is. I understand what his problems are. And I'm going to take care of him, not these rich fat cats who can take care of themselves because, well, they're rich. That played really well. And Jackson's going to win by a considerable margin over the unpopular incumbent John Adams. John Adams is unpopular for a variety of reasons, mostly not necessarily even his fault. He just takes the blame for things because he had been president when it happened, as always happens. Andrew Jackson is a really interesting guy. He was not born to wealth. As a matter of fact, he was born very poor back in the backwoods. Nobody's actually entirely sure exactly where, because the area in which he was born, they didn't own land. His family didn't own the land. They were squatters. So it was somewhere near the border of North and South Carolina, and so he kind of gets claimed by both states that he's from there. That's never how he really saw it. He was orphaned by the age of 14. He went off to fight in the American Revolution as a young man. He later grew up, educated himself, got married to a wealthy woman, got involved in politics, the law and politics. Through that, became a militia commander. Through that, was put in charge of the forces defending New Orleans in the War of 1812. Had a reputation by then of being good at fighting the Indians and things, the main things that the militia did at the time. And so when he wins at New Orleans, he comes to national prominence for the first time, and he'll run for Senate and be elected to the Senate. He spends time, it's from Tennessee, by the way, at this point. And so he does a lot of things through the years. He fights the Indians several times. He makes friends with Sam Houston. He was a patron of Sam Houston's. He was a bit older than Sam. He had a reputation for being tough and ornery. He was very prickly about his pride. He actually fought several duels in his lifetime, and when he died, he still had some pistol balls in him from earlier duels. He'd actually even killed a man in a duel. His nickname was Old Hickory because hickory is a particularly hard wood, very tough. And the joke was that he was as tough as an old hickory root. Anyway, so while he had started off poor, his adult life, he was mainly a wealthy man. And so his play to be a common man, just like everyone, just like you guys, basically, is how he always put it, didn't really show the truth of the matter. He had money, and he's a slave owner and all of that sort of thing. But he ran as a common man, and it worked for him. He spoke very plainly. He did not have a posh accent. He was not a brilliant speaker who had been trained in all of the classics of Greek and Latin to throw in phrases like that into his speech. So he came across more humble, more common guy, right? And that was really popular. That was really popular to this large group of men now who could finally vote. And so they helped to get him elected. Now, as president, he continued to promote the idea of a majority rule and the expansion of the vote to include all free men. Okay? He wants every free man, adult, to be able to vote, regardless of property. It's not just because it'll help him get elected again. That's part of it, certainly. But because from his background, he wanted to be able to promote the people where he came from. So to a degree, it's accurate to say that he had a common man mentality while not actually being one of those people really anymore. But the idea of spreading political power to more people, and thereby increasing the amount of the level of democracy in the nation, becomes known as Jacksonian democracy. That's how strongly tied to it he is. So here's a picture of the inauguration of Jackson. And after his inauguration, he had invited the crowd at his swearing in to come into the White House. And these guys had been drinking all day. And they came in and they basically wrecked the joint. He put out food and whiskey and beer and cider and invited these people in, and they loved him for it. And here he is, kind of off just to the right of center, greeting them as they come in, and all of his supporters are there, young and old. You can tell that they're not particularly well off. You see the boy is barefoot, for example. And his nickname there on the banner, Old Hickory, was his nickname. And that's going to be the code word that I want you to remember. So pay attention to that. Hickory, Hickory, Hickory. That's the code word. So what is the change then? What's different? Well, from 1800 to 1828, we had an era where they called it Jeffersonian democracy. Government was for the people. In other words, government existed to work for the people, but the common person was not expected to be in government. They were supposed to be governed by the capable, well-educated leaders, the notables. In Jeffersonian democracy, we had democracy in political life, but not in a social or economic situation. Jefferson championed the farmer in an agricultural society. We know that. We've talked about that before, and was opposed to increasing industrialization. And he and his followers believed that in a limited government with a relatively weak executive, they really wanted a relatively weak central government, period, as weak as they could possibly get away with and still have a functional system. Jacksonian democracy, on the other hand, which is going to go from 1828 to 1860, is a little bit different. Jacksonian democracy is government by the people, in which the common voice is not ignored, where common people vote, elect people like them, and get more involved directly. Jacksonian democracy believes in democracy in all aspects of life, social, economic, and political. So not just can you vote or do you have the same legal rights, but are you socially equal? Do you have the same economic chances that other people have? Now, it doesn't work that way, but that's what they felt it should be like. Jacksonian Democrats champion the farmer and the laborer, the little guys. See, the difference here is they don't have a problem with industrialization. They're starting to see the benefits of it and would like to capture those benefits. However, the idea is that you still have to look out somewhat for the little guy in the factories as well as the small farmer who owns his own farm. Again, like Jefferson, they both believed in limited government. But Jacksonian Democrats believed that you needed a strong president. You needed a stronger executive branch in order to make sure that everything was done the way it ought to be done. And rather than to leave it to a weak executive who may not be able to push the issues that needed enforcement. Now, one of the things that Jackson had promised to do if he was elected was that he was going to reform the government. He was going to fix all of these problems by putting the right people in the right jobs. Remember, he's still upset about the whole corrupt bargain thing. And so, as soon as he's elected, he begins replacing government officials with his friends and supporters. Okay. This is known as the spoil system, and it comes from an old saying, to the victors go the spoils, or to the victors belong the spoils. And Jackson's enemies are going to call it corruption in government, just like he had called the bargain in 1824 the corrupt bargain. But Jackson and Van Buren defended the system. They said that it was okay because it reflected the will of the people, and that if another candidate had won, they could have done the exact same thing, and it would have been acceptable and all right. Here's a great little political cartoon over here to the side, which you may want to take a peek at, because I really love that cartoon. And you've got Jackson riding this pig, which is rooting around and for money and things, and it's just a great little cartoon. Another factor in this increasing democratization is that 20 different states are going to write new state constitutions. And in those new constitutions, they further democracy by expanding the vote to basically all white men and begin to reapportion representation based on the shifting populations so that you have a better representation of the people. And this new constitutions also increased the number of elected rather than appointed positions within the states. Things like sheriffs became elected officials rather than appointed ones. Some places that's judges as well. Texas, for example, elects our judges. We elect judges. We don't have them appointed and approved. Additionally, they enshrine the principles and policies of classical liberalism, sometimes known as laissez-faire economics, by limiting the government's role in the economy. Essentially, they say that the government should, as much as is possible, stay out of it. Stay out of the decisions of businesses. Don't regulate. Now, that's different from nowadays, where we have quite a bit of regulation. But in those days, they wanted as little as possible. Jackson was, like everyone else, not a one-dimensional person. One of the ways that you can see that is in his view of the natives. While he's most famous for being an Indian fighter and someone who helped to remove the Indians from their traditional lands in the East, at the same time, he also adopted an Indian orphan, raised it as his son, and got that boy into West Point, which was like one of the most prestigious schools. You have to have political supporters to get into it. You have to have a sponsor. I mean, it was a big deal. Unfortunately, the boy caught smallpox and died in his first year there, but he raised the child as his own because he had no children of his own. He and his wife never had kids. Now, ever since we started arriving on the Atlantic coast in the 1600s, Europeans had been constantly pushing the Indians westward. Okay, you should know that by this point. But by the 1820s, only about 100,000 natives still lived east of the Mississippi. Most of these are going to be in the southeast, in the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And that's fine for a while. Now, these southeastern native tribes are the most like Europeans. They have already basically adopted European dress. They are farmers. They are settled. These are not Plains Indians. These are not people following the buffalo and living in teepees and all of that sort of thing. We're talking the Sequoia, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, what were known as the seven civilized tribes. And they're called that because they act more like the Europeans. Heck, some of the wealthy ones were even slaveholding and planters. I mean, some of them were actually fairly well-to-do. But Jackson basically considered Indians to be conquered subjects who had one of two choices: adopt white culture and become citizens of the United States, or move west and get out of our way. When gold is discovered in the Cherokee lands in Georgia in 1828, Jackson is going to push Congress to pass a law that's going to force the Indians to move west. It's known as the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The Cherokees are going to sue to keep their lands, to keep their sovereignty and the rule of their own lands. And the Marshall Court is going to side with them. The Federalist John Marshall Court is going to side with the Cherokees in the case. It's Worcester versus Georgia. Supposedly, Jackson then said, John Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Of course, the problem is that's Jackson's job. As the head of the executive branch, his job is to carry out the law as interpreted by the court. And so he's really basically refusing to do his job. And so, as a result of the Indian Removal Act, natives are going to begin moving westward to an area that is known as the Indian Territory, now modern-day Oklahoma, basically, and parts of Kansas and Nebraska as well. And they signed several treaties with the Indians and forced them to move there. In 1838, it's been 8 years, President Van Buren orders U.S. soldiers to take the last 16,000 or so of the natives living in Georgia and march them forcibly basically at bayonet point into camps and force them to march overland to Oklahoma. These folks are not allowed to really properly pack for the journey. Their cabins are actually, many of them have their homes destroyed by the soldiers that come to arrest them. They're forced to leave with virtually nothing. And so on this trip, they get very cold, they get very hungry. The supplies that were supposed to be readied for them along the way often were either inadequate in quality, in quantity, or frequently both. Without adequate clothing or food, a lot of them got sick, and about 4,000 of them, this is about 1 in 4, died on this trip, mostly the elderly and the young. And for this reason, they were often they often even had to leave the bodies. They weren't allowed even to stay long enough in one place to bury them. And for this reason, the route that they took has become known as the Trail of Tears. This is really one of, as far as a nation, this is one of our low points. This is how American governments treated the Native Americans has been just embarrassing. I mean, it's just wrong. It's nothing we can change at this point, but it's something that we need to remember so that if we're ever in a similar situation, that we can do better. And here's a map showing the Indian removal. And you can see where the Cherokee are there in northern Georgia, and the routes that they took all the way over to Oklahoma, and where the Cherokee and the Creek and the Seminole and the Chickasaw and the Choctaw, where these tribes were sent. One of the things that's going to happen during Jackson's presidency is that the conflict between state and national authority is going to come up again. And it does so by raising the head of sectionalism, states' rights, and nullification. And these are issues that aren't really going to ever truly be resolved. even though the Civil War will be fought to help resolve them. Now, sectionalism is when a person puts the interests of the region in which they live ahead of the interests of the nation as a whole. It happens quite a bit. For example, if the people of the Gulf coasts, the oil producing states on the Gulf coasts, push for policies that are going to increase oil prices because that's good for us, that's not necessarily good for the country as a whole. While the oil companies become more profitable and that helps support the economy of especially Texas and Louisiana, the rest of the country, that's going to suffer. Their gas prices are going to go up. Their heating oil prices are going to go up. All of that's going to go up, and that makes things more expensive for them. Makes their life a little bit more difficult. So that's an example of sectionalism. If you were to support that idea because it would be good for where you are, rather than because it would be good for everyone. Okay. The three main regions, of the United States at this time are the North, which is essentially the old Mid-Atlantic, New England, basically from Pennsylvania, Ohio-ish, over to the east to New Jersey, New York, through there, and then up north all the way up to Maine. That's the North. The South, the slaveholding states basically, and the West. These are your states like Minnesota and Illinois and Indiana and Iowa and Missouri and all of that. Kentucky, Tennessee would be sort of involved in that as well. Okay, and the issues that they most hotly argued over in the early 1800s were public land sales, internal improvements, and tariffs. Basically, the things that were involved in the American system. And how it breaks down is in this little chart down here. The North, the South, and the West had different ideas about what would be good. So, for example, in public lands, the North wanted it to be expensive. The leaders of the North wanted public lands, particularly out in the West, to be more expensive. Why? Because it cuts off the number of workers that get fed up with being factory workers and move west to become farmers. The people of the South wanted it to be cheap because they wanted to be able to expand out to the West as the cotton growing regions of the South began to get depleted. And the people of the West would really love to see it free. But if not free, at least cheap, because they're the ones that are living out there already and want to increase the amount of land that they've got. Most of them, of course, are farmers. The building of infrastructure, the North was in favor of it. They wanted to tie their factories out to the West for the raw materials from the West and as markets for their easy for him to say, as markets for their products. Out in the West. Okay, so the North was in favor of it. The South didn't want it. They didn't feel like they needed it. Certainly didn't want to pay for it. And the West really, really wants it. And tariffs, though the West was in favor of tariffs. The South was adamantly opposed to it, and the North was very in favor of it. They wanted it to be as high as possible because that meant the most profit for their industries. Now, basically, I just explained this on a previous slide. So tariffs, hopefully you know this, are taxes on imported goods. And this is really the biggest issue. The South opposed them because they exported something like 85% of the cotton and then used the money that they made there to import goods with the proceeds. So they would sell their cotton to someone like England, and their agent in England would turn around and buy stuff and ship it back to the South. If there were high tariffs, that meant that their spending money didn't go as far. The North liked those high tariffs because it helped their industries. They would become more profitable. Not only would they sell more goods because American versions of the same thing would be cheaper, which I believe we've discussed before, and if we haven't, let me know in the Discord, and we'll go over the concept here of how protective tariffs work in some detail. But they favored them because not only would it make the domestically produced goods less expensive compared to the imported ones, and therefore people would buy more of the domestic ones. It also enabled them to do something really sneaky, which is raise their prices some. If the tariffs were really high, then they could raise their domestic prices some, make more profit, and still be less expensive alternative than the import. And therefore they make even more money. And the West supported those tariffs because they wanted it to pay for the internal improvements that they were looking for. That's the real reason they cared for it. This becomes something of a crisis in 1828 when Congress passed a very high tariff bill, the Tariff of 1828, more commonly known in the South, especially as the Tariff of Abominations. An abomination is a monster, so it's this monstrous tariff. Southerners were outraged. There were no Southern congressmen who were in favor of this. They felt like the interests of the more heavily populated North had determined national policy. They felt like that because that's exactly what happened. They also kind of unfairly blamed Adams. Adams was not a supporter of this. He actually tried to veto it because he thought it was too much. But they voted against him because it still got through. And the tariff would hit South Carolina especially hard because they were already in a recession. And so leaders in the state begin discussing the idea of secession, leaving the Union, to secede, S-E-C-E-D-E, which is not the same as the word succeed, S-U-C-C-E-E-D. And that's a pet peeve of mine, and please do not mistake the two. Now, Jackson's vice president is a man named John C. Calhoun. And Jackson and Calhoun aren't what you'd call real close, but Calhoun is from South Carolina. And so he tells his people, look, you don't need to secede. He's trying to avoid that. Instead, he proposes a concept known as the doctrine of nullification. And this is the idea that a state has a right to nullify or reject any national law that the state feels is unconstitutional. And this nullification idea springs from the doctrine of states' rights, the theory that a state is sovereign and therefore has the right to judge and therefore reject or ignore, if they choose, acts of the federal government. And this is based on the earlier Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. That's where these ideas are based. And really, it's all about who's got the authority, you see. Can the states just ignore what the federal national government says? Jackson is infuriated at this. People are resisting the authority of the federal government, him. Worst of all, his vice president is the guy who comes up with and publicly pushes for this concept. He and Calhoun become enemies, political ones. He's so mad, he threatens to use the army to go into South Carolina and enforce the tariffs and hang anyone who resists. Faced with an armed conflict against the rest of the United States, South Carolina backs down from this. But the idea of secession is out there. The question of authority, final authority, has been brought back up yet again. And it's not going to get laid to rest for a while until the Civil War. Another issue of sectionalism is, of course, slavery. And we're going to have our first crisis over slavery in 1820. Now I'm not real certain why the authors of this text decided to include the Missouri Compromise in this chapter. At least chronologically, it doesn't really seem to fit. As far as tying into the concept of sectionalism and states' rights, it does. But chronologically, it really doesn't, because this actually takes place, like I said, back in 1820. So years before Jackson comes into office. And so it sort of makes sense from a thematic viewpoint, but from a chronological standpoint, it sort of doesn't seem like it belongs in this chapter, and it's a bit confusing that it's been put here. But it's an important issue, and so we're going to discuss it for a few minutes. So what's going on is that in 1819, Missouri had applied to be admitted to the Union as a full-fledged state. And at that time, there were an even number of free and slave states. There were 11 of each. This meant that there was a deadlock on the issue of slavery in the U.S. Senate. Okay, meaning that the South, the slave states, could block any effort by the free states to outlaw slavery. Okay, both sides would like to break this deadlock, but only if they could do so in their favor. And the trouble is that Missouri allowed slavery, and northern members of the House of Representatives, which they dominated, much more people in the free states in the north, many more people, therefore more representatives. It's based on population. So they block Missouri's admission and swear that they'll continue to block it unless Missouri agrees to outlaw slavery and be a free state. Now, this made the Southern congressmen, the congressmen from slave states, very angry because they saw it as the opening ploy in a move to outlaw slavery entirely. Why? Because it probably was an opening ploy by the free states to outlaw slavery entirely. And they argued on fairly good constitutional grounds that the federal government really had no right to make those decisions, that was not described in the Constitution, and therefore, as the 10th Amendment says, it's up to the state to decide that. And while I find the entire institution reprehensible, at least from a technical standpoint, I'm not sure that the Southerners were wrong there. Of course, after the Civil War, it becomes a moot point because we amend the Constitution to flat out outlaw slavery, and that's a great thing. But at the time, that hadn't happened yet. Okay, they say that the federal government has no right to make this requirement of Missouri. It had never been an issue before for previous states that had been added under the provisions of the Northwest Ordinance and other following up ordinances that had adjusted what the requirements were. This has never been made a requirement for statehood. And so they said, you can't require Missouri to do something you've never required anyone else to do. It's just not legal, and it's not right, and it's not fair. And I personally, I kind of side with the Southern congressman on this, and it's just me. But the way that the system had been working, that was not a fair question to ask. And so this issue is going to be deadlocked in the Congress for 2 years. They'll argue about it. And finally, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, who's known as the Great Compromiser because he comes up with several compromises throughout his career, comes up with a plan that both sides could accept. And it's got two main parts. The first thing is that Maine, which had wanted to be admitted as a free state for quite a while, it had been part of Massachusetts. It was basically a colony of Massachusetts. That Maine could enter the Union as a separate free state, and Missouri would enter as a slave state, which would maintain the balance. Okay, so that's going to maintain the balance. So now instead of 11-11, you go to 12-12. Okay. Then slavery would be prohibited in the rest of the lands acquired in the Louisiana Purchase that were north of Missouri's southern border. And you can see that on this map here, that green, basically we're talking about that green area where it says unorganized territory. That's what we're talking about. Okay, they say that area all the way out to the Rockies will have slavery prohibited there. Now, that red line, that 36 degrees 30 minutes line, that's the southern border of Missouri. South of that border in the Louisiana Purchase was open to slavery. And when Arkansas eventually becomes a state, Arkansas will be a slave state. When Oklahoma is a territory, Oklahoma doesn't become a state until after the Civil War, slavery is permitted there in the what they call the Indian Territory for a long time. Okay. Now that doesn't apply to Texas and all that because those are possessions of Mexico at the time or Spain and not part of the United States. So none of this applies to any of that. Now, the issue here is that both sides accept this, okay? Nobody's really happy about it. That's what compromise is about, is finding a solution that nobody's completely happy with, but everybody can live with. But the problem isn't gone. The problem of sectionalism trumping nationalism, the problem of two separate societies in one nation, the problem of mistrust, and the question of who has the real authority, none of these issues are being addressed by this, really. This is just a Band-Aid. Okay, it's duct tape. It is not a permanent solution. And it will eventually fail. Andrew Jackson was a pretty complicated guy, like I've said, but one thing was not complicated for him. He hated, absolutely despised the Second Bank of the United States. And he went to war against it. And when Jackson went to war, Jackson tended to win. The problem is twofold. First of all, he felt it was an unconstitutional monopoly that promoted the wealthy and hurt the common man, who were his biggest supporters, right? So obviously he's going to be opposed to anything that threatens their livelihoods. Anything he can do to support them is going to help him and his friends to stay in power. The other problem is he really doesn't like the guy who runs the bank, a fellow by the name of Biddle. Biddle, even at one point, claims that he is more powerful than the President of the United States. That's a direct assault on Jackson's authority. And as we've seen before, Jackson does not like that one little bit. So he determines he's going to destroy it. He says at one point, "You are a den of vipers and thieves. I intend to rout you out, and by the eternal God, I will rout you out." So to operate, the bank has to have a charter. And they had been granted one and 20 years before, but it had a time limit on it. Okay, it was supposed to come up in 1836. Jackson, they make a bad decision. They think in 1832 that there are enough supporters in Congress to get a bill to recharter it passed, whether Jackson wants to sign it or not. So they do, in fact, get a new charter passed, and Jackson vetoes it. After he vetoes it, the bank then fights back, trying to get the veto overridden, which can be done, takes 2/3 vote of Congress. In the meantime, Jackson plays really hardball by taking the government's money out of the bank. As president, he can do this. And so he takes the money out of the national bank and transfers it all to a variety of state banks, propping up them, inflating them, and taking all of the cash out of the Second Bank of the United States. And that's what's really going to kill it. So they had miscalculated when they tried to re-up their charter early, but then to compound the error, they doubled down and Jackson destroys them. And eventually Jackson wins, but it does hurt the national economy because it severely limits the availability of money. And so a lot of things just can't be accomplished, paid for, done because of that. And this is a political cartoon of Jackson destroying the second bank of the United States, running off Biddle, who's the guy with the cloven feet and the horns on his head and looks like a devil. That would be Biddle. And he's doing it with an order for the removal of the public money deposited in the United States Bank. And that's how he's going to destroy it. And he's got a supporter saying, huzzah! And Biddle and his friends running as the bank collapses. Nice subtlety there. I love the lightning bolts. So at first, after the national bank is gone, things seem pretty good. But the local state banks that Jackson favored, where he put all the government's money, started to, now remember, money is not paper. Money at the time was coinage, was gold and silver coins. And so what they did was they printed paper bills that could be exchanged for those coins. But the paper bills were just a lot more portable. There was no regulation over how much paper these banks would print. And so they printed more and more and more and loaned out more and more and more money simply by printing the bills. And what happens is that money supply gets increased, but that means that the value of each paper dollar was reduced. The increase in the money supply makes each dollar worth less. And there's a little chart over there that shows you the value of cash that goes down as the amount of money, the monetary base, increases. Okay, and this is called inflation because what goes up is the costs of things. The prices of goods are inflated because the value of each individual dollar is less, is reduced, if that makes sense. So when a dollar buys what 50 cents used to buy, that's inflation. So as that inflation kicks up higher and higher, people start to realize that there are problems and they panic. And you get a run on the bank. They basically, everybody takes their paper money, runs to these state banks and tries to withdraw the gold and silver, the cash, the real money. When too many people do this, the banks are unable to pay and they collapse, they go out of business. Okay. The widespread bank failures cause a depression, and we get the Depression of 1837. At the time, it was called the Great Depression. Now we think of the Great Depression as the 1930s Great Depression. But the Depression of 1837 was actually a bit worse. And it happens right after Martin Van Buren becomes president. Guess who gets stuck with the blame for it? That's right, Martin Van Buren. And he's never really going to recover politically from that. It's definitely a pretty major factor in why he loses to the Whigs in 1840 after only one term. Speaking of the Whigs, they're going to be a new political party, which springs up, and basically the thing they have in common is they don't like Andrew Jackson. And so they become the Whigs, a separate national political party. And they take their name from an old British political party, which was opposed to the power of the king. The British Whigs want Parliament to have more power and the king to have less. The American Whigs want the president to have less power. They're basically calling Jackson a king. And they want Congress to have more authority. So that's what they have in common with the British Whigs. And this is the start of the second party system. So you've got the Democrats and the Whigs at this point. Prominent members of the Whigs were Henry Clay, also known as the Great Compromiser, as we've mentioned, and Daniel Webster, who was a Northerner and a very famous orator. He was a marvelous public speaker and a member of the Congress. Here's a political cartoon. Just looking at it, think for a few minutes and try to sort of analyze it yourself. Is the cartoonist a fan of Jackson's or not? What is he trying to say about Jackson? Look at all of the pieces of this, the captions, the artwork, the background, what Jackson is wearing, what he's holding in his hands, what he's standing on, all of those things to help you to sort of figure out the idea that the political cartoonist is trying to get across, and which side, which viewpoint that political cartoonist might have. Which political party would he have belonged to, the Whigs or the Democrat Republicans? So the Whigs, they have some issues. It makes it a little difficult for them to get a candidate elected the first time around. When in 1836 they run up against Martin Van Buren, who Jackson had picked as his successor. Now Jackson was still pretty popular, and so Van Buren did well and won. Now, Van Buren is not as popular, and so when the Whigs run again in 1840, they run with a fellow named William Henry Harrison. And Harrison is portrayed as a simple farmer from Ohio who lives in a log cabin and drinks cider. He's not some fancy wine-sipping dude in a big white house, although he actually was the son of a wealthy Virginian planter. But they campaign him as a common man. And lo and behold, he wins. Van Buren had shown himself to be a little bit more elitist, and people didn't like that about him. Unfortunately, Harrison gets sick, probably from bad water and not pneumonia that his doctor blamed for it, and will die less than a month after taking office. And so his vice president, John Tyler, will become president. And this is the first time that that's happened, that a sitting president had died. And so the Constitution is, unfortunately, not super clear on exactly the succession. But this sets the precedent that the vice president does, in fact, do that. And so really until 1967, when they passed the 25th Amendment, when the 25th Amendment is ratified, it's going to be a little bit in question as to exactly what the order of succession is. But the 25th Amendment will take care of that. Oh, and the reference to Tippecanoe, how Harrison got famous was he was a militia commander, and he had fought the natives at a battle called the Battle of Tippecanoe. And so that was sort of his nickname. And so the campaign slogan for them was Tippecanoe and Tyler too, because it rhymed, and they set little songs to it and all that sort of thing. All right. One last thing I want to mention for today is the colonization movement. And I really didn't feel like it fit in with any of the other topics through here. I don't really know why the author included it here, other than that it happened during this time period that it began. But in 1817, the American Colonization Society had been formed by black and white abolitionists. Now, that early on in the history of America, there were not a whole lot of abolitionists, and most of them were freed blacks or escaped slaves. The ACS is going to argue in favor of gradual emancipation and for financial compensation to slave owners. This gets rid of the slave owners' argument that they can't afford to have their property taken from them because they have so much money invested in it. And the idea is that they will slowly get rid of slavery, but that the slave owners will be basically paid back for the money that they had spent on the slaves. This being the least painful means of ending slavery in America. It was rejected by pretty much everybody. Another idea, though, that the ACS has is that the freed blacks should be returned to Africa. And they needed to establish that the United States needed to establish basically a colony on the West African coast. And we do that. It's back during Monroe's presidency, and the colony is known as Liberia. We do make it essentially a free nation, basically immediately, but of course, with our backing, they're somewhat protected. They're more of a protectorate than really a free nation. And the capital is Monrovia because President Monroe was president when all of this took place. Why did they ask for this? Well, a lot of the members believed that freed blacks and whites could never really live side by side successfully in America. They just couldn't coexist peacefully. That there was too much bad blood too much troubled water under the bridge, I guess. Too much history, too much oppression, and that the whites would never forget that they had been able to lord it over the blacks, and the blacks would never forget that the whites had done that to them, had mistreated them, and enslaved them. And so the idea was, if we take them back to Africa, then that gets rid of that source of conflict. The problem is most of the African Americans don't want to go. By this point, most are second or third generation, at least, in America. They don't know Africa. They're as American as anyone else. And they don't want to go off to some strange land where they don't know the customs, the languages of their neighbors, that just doesn't appeal to them, and start over in some sort of frontierish thing that would be strange, and they're just not interested in it. So they don't go. The idea does come back in the early 20th century, and it gains some acceptance by some people at that point. In 1302, you'll talk about a fellow by the name of Marcus Garvey, who helped to try to make African repatriation something of a reality. Of course, it doesn't really take off then either. So anyway, that's the colonization movement, which does start up roughly during this time, and is mentioned in the text in this chapter. It just doesn't really fit in with the rest of what I was talking about, but it's an important concept, and I wanted to make sure that we did discuss it just a bit. So that's going to do it for today. You will need to watch out for a quiz. It's going to be a few days till we get to our next test, of course, and just keep an eye on that revised COVID schedule. And we will talk to you soon. Like I said, keep an eye out for a quiz, and go ahead and start reading Chapter 10. Y'all have a good day.